The sky was burning. Orange and red flames stretched across the horizon of Karth Prime like angry wounds torn into the fabric of the universe. Sergeant Jake Morrison pressed his back against a broken wall and tried to catch his breath. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Around him, the sounds of war filled the air. Plasma bolts screamed overhead. Explosions shook the ground beneath his boots. Soldiers shouted orders in languages he could barely understand. Jake had been fighting in this war for 3 years now. 3 long years since humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition and sent its soldiers to fight alongside alien species against the Vexery Collective. The Vexery were conquerors. They moved from world to world, taking everything and leaving nothing behind but ash and bones. The Coalition had been fighting them for decades before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. When humanity finally made contact with the galaxy, most alien species had dismissed them. Humans were too young, too primitive, too emotional. They lived such short lives and made such reckless decisions. What could they possibly offer to a war that had been raging for centuries? But Jake had proven them wrong. He and soldiers like him had earned respect the hard way. Not through words or politics, but through blood and sacrifice. Through standing their ground when others ran. Through fighting with a fierce determination that seemed to confuse and impress the aliens who fought beside them. Jake checked his pulse rifle. The weapon was hot in his hands, almost too hot to hold. He had been firing for hours without rest. His unit had been pinned down in this ruined city since dawn, and the sun was now beginning to set behind the smoke-filled clouds. They were running low on ammunition. They were running low on hope, but Jake refused to give up. That was not something humans did easily. He looked to his left and saw the unit medic crouched behind a fallen pillar. The medic was a Thalorian named Veth Saran. Jake had worked with Veth for almost 2 years now, and in that time, the alien had become more than just a colleague. Veth had become a friend. The Thalorians were unlike any species Jake had ever encountered. They were tall and slender, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow faintly in low light. Their eyes were large and gentle, filled with a kind of ancient wisdom that made Jake feel like a child in comparison. The Thalorians were a peaceful people. They did not believe in violence. They chose to serve as healers instead of fighters, and they were very good at what they did. Veth had saved the lives of dozens of soldiers in their time together. Human, Thalorian, and countless other species. The alien never hesitated, never showed fear, never turned away from even the most terrible wounds. Jake respected Veth more than almost anyone he had ever known. The two of them shared a bond that went beyond words. It was the kind of bond that forms between people who've seen death together and survived. Jake did not fully understand Thalorian culture, but he knew that Veth considered him a true friend. That meant something. That meant everything. A massive explosion suddenly rocked the ground. Jake was thrown sideways, his helmet slamming against the broken wall. Stars danced in front of his eyes. His ears were ringing so loudly that he could barely hear his own thoughts. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and looked around frantically. That was when he saw Veth fall. The Thalorian had been struck by debris from the explosion. Veth lay on the ground, not moving, blue blood pooling beneath the slender body. Jake felt his heart stop. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. All the noise and chaos of the battle faded into silence. Then Jake was running. He did not think. He did not plan. He did not consider the danger or the odds against him. He simply moved, his body acting on pure instinct. Plasma bolts flew past him so close he could feel the heat on his skin. The ground shook with more explosions. Shrapnel filled the air like deadly rain. Jake did not stop. He reached Veth and dropped to his knees beside the fallen medic. The Thalarian's eyes were half closed, flickering with fading light. Jake could see the wounds now, deep cuts across Veth's chest and side. The blue blood was spreading fast. "Stay with me," Jake said, his voice rough and desperate. "Do not you dare give up on me." He heard the whistle of incoming artillery. He looked up and saw the bright streak of another shell falling toward them. There was no time to run. There was no time to drag Veth to safety. There was only time to make a choice. Jake threw himself over his friend. The shell struck the ground 20 feet away. The explosion was deafening. Jake felt the force of it slam into his back like a giant fist. Pain exploded through his body as shrapnel tore into his flesh. He felt 3 pieces of hot metal bury themselves in his back. He felt a plasma burn sear across his shoulder. But he did not move. He kept his body over Veth, shielding the Thalarian from the debris and fire that rained down around him. When the dust began to settle, Jake forced himself to move. Every breath was agony. Every movement sent waves of pain through his body. But he grabbed Veth by the arms and began to drag the unconscious medic toward the evacuation point that it was nearly 100 yards away. Jake covered that distance on pure willpower alone. He crawled through mud and ash, through blood and rubble, never letting go of his friend. Soldiers shouted at him to stop, to let others help, but Jake could not hear them. His vision was narrowing. His strength was fading. But he would not stop. He could not stop. He reached the evacuation shuttle just as his legs finally gave out. Medics rushed forward to take Veth from his arms. Jake collapsed on the metal floor of the shuttle, his blood mixing with the dirt and ash that covered him. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Veth being carried to the medical bay. The Thalarian was still alive. Jake had done what he set out to do. He had saved his friend. Jake spent the next 2 months in a medical pod, floating in healing fluid while machines slowly repaired the damage to his body. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. They said the wounds should have killed him. They said no one could understand how he had managed to carry Veth so far with so much metal buried in his back. Jake did not think it was luck. He thought it was simply what you do for the people you care about. You do not give up. You do not stop. You keep going until the job is done, no matter what it costs you. That was what it meant to be human. The war ended 8 months after the Battle of Karth Prime. The Vexury Collective, beaten and broken after years of fighting, finally agreed to sign a peace treaty. Soldiers across the galaxy put down their weapons and went home. Some celebrated with joy. Others simply felt empty, unsure of what to do with themselves now that the fighting was over. Jake Morrison was one of those who felt empty. He returned to Earth, with a metal pin to his chest and scars covering his back. The doctors had healed most of his wounds, but some marks would never fade. He could still feel the phantom pain of the shrapnel sometimes, especially on cold nights when he lay alone in his bed and stared at the ceiling. His family welcomed him home with open arms. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand and told him how proud he was. His younger sister hung a banner across the front porch that said, "Welcome home, hero," in big, colorful letters. Jake smiled and hugged them all, but inside he felt like a stranger in his own home. The world had moved on without him. His friends had new jobs, new relationships, new lives. They did not understand what he had seen out there among the stars. They did not understand the things he had done, the people he had lost, the weight he carried in his heart. They looked at him like he was the same person who had left 3 years ago. But Jake knew that person was gone forever. He tried to find work. He took a job at a factory, then quit after 2 weeks. He tried construction, but the loud noises made him jump and reach for a weapon that was no longer there. He worked at a quiet bookstore for a month before the boredom became too much to bear. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt real. The only thing that brought him any peace was sitting alone at night, looking up at the stars, and wondering how Veth Saran was doing. Veth had returned to the Thalorian homeworld of Endara after the war ended. The Thalorians had welcomed their healers home with great ceremony and honor. Veth had been recognized for saving countless lives during the conflict. But Jake knew that the recognition meant little to his friend. Thalorians did not care about glory or medals. They cared about duty and connection, and the bonds between living beings. Among the Thalorian people, there was a sacred tradition called the Korath Bond. When someone saved your life, especially at great personal cost, a special connection was formed between you. It was more than friendship, more than family. It was a spiritual tie that linked two souls together across time and space. The person who was saved carried a debt of gratitude that could never be fully repaid, only honored through a lifetime of remembrance and care. Veth had tried to reach out to Jake many times after returning to Endara. The Thalorian sent messages across the vast distances of space, words of thanks and connection and hope. Jake read every message, but he rarely replied. He did not know what to say. He had never asked for gratitude. He had never wanted to be treated like a hero. He had simply done what he believed was right, what any decent person would have done. The idea of being owed something made him uncomfortable. He did not save Veth because he wanted something in return. He saved Veth because that was who he was. 3 years passed on Earth. Jake drifted from place to place, job to job, never settling, never finding peace. He dated a few women, but the relationships never lasted. He made some new friends, but the friendships always felt shallow. He was a man searching for something he could not name. A purpose he could not find. Then, one day, a message arrived that changed everything. It came from Endara, from a Thalorian healer named Korin, who worked at a sanctuary in the capital city. The message was brief and formal, but the words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. Veth Saran was dying. The healers did not understand the cause. Veth had seemed healthy after the war, recovering fully from the injuries sustained at Korath Prime. But over the past year, something had gone wrong. The Thalorian had grown weak and pale. Energy faded from those gentle eyes. The will to live seemed to be slipping away like sand through open fingers. Some of the healers believed it was a physical illness, damage to internal organs that had never fully healed. Others whispered that it was something deeper, something spiritual. They said Veth was suffering from a wound of the soul, a pain that medicine could not touch. The Korath bond had never been properly honored. The connection between Veth and Jake had been left incomplete, and that incompleteness was slowly draining the life from the Thalorian's body. Jake did not know if he believed in such things. He was a simple soldier from Colorado who had grown up hunting deer in the mountains and fishing in cold streams. He did not understand alien spirituality or mystical bonds between souls. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His friend was dying, and he had to help. He sold everything he owned. His car, his furniture, his collection of old books. He used the money to book passage on the first transport ship heading to the Thalorian sector of space. The journey would take 3 weeks through the darkness between stars. 3 weeks of sitting alone in a small cabin, wondering if he would arrive in time. Jake did not care about the discomfort. He did not care about the cost. He had spent 3 years feeling lost and empty, searching for a purpose that always seemed just out of reach. Now he finally knew what he had to do. He was going to save his friend again. Whatever it took. The transport ship launched at midnight, rising through the clouds and leaving Earth behind. Jake watched through a small window as his home planet grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among billions. He did not feel sad. He did not feel afraid. For the first time in 3 years, He felt something close to peace. He was finally going where he belonged. The stars stretched out before him, cold and beautiful and endless. Somewhere out there, on a world he had never seen, Veth was waiting. Jake closed his eyes and made a silent promise to the universe. He would not be too late. He would not fail. He would stand beside his friend and fight this battle just like he had fought all the others, because that was what humans did. They showed up. They refused to quit. They loved fiercely and loyally, even when it hurt, even when it cost them everything. Jake Morrison was coming, and he would not stop until his friend was saved. The planet Endara was the most beautiful world Jake Morrison had ever seen. As the transport ship descended through the atmosphere, he pressed his face against the window like a child seeing snow for the first time. The land below was covered in forests of silver trees that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Rivers of crystal clear water wound between gentle hills. Cities of white stone rose from the landscape like dreams made solid. Everything was peaceful. Everything was calm. It was a world built by a people who had rejected violence and chosen harmony instead. Jake felt out of place the moment he stepped off the ship. He was a soldier, a man of war, carrying the scars of battle on his body and in his heart. The Thalorians who passed him in the spaceport looked at him with curiosity and something that might have been concern. Humans were still rare visitors to Endara. A human with the hard eyes of a combat veteran was rarer still. But Jake did not care about the stares. He had only one purpose, and nothing would distract him from it. He hired a transport to take him to the healing sanctuary, where Veth was being cared for. The journey took several hours, winding through those silver forests and over hills covered in flowers that Jake had no names for. The driver was a young Thalorian who tried to make conversation, but Jake was too anxious to speak. His mind was racing with fear and hope and desperate determination. The sanctuary was located in a valley surrounded by mountains. It was a sprawling complex of white buildings connected by covered walkways and gardens, filled with plants that seemed to sing softly in the breeze. Thalorian healers moved through the grounds in flowing robes, their faces calm and their movements graceful. Jake found Veth in a private room overlooking one of the gardens. The sight of his friend nearly broke his heart. Veth lay on a bed of soft fabric, eyes closed, breathing shallow and weak. The pale blue skin that Jake remembered as bright and healthy was now faded almost to gray. The gentle glow that all Thalorians seemed to carry had dimmed to almost nothing. Veth looked fragile. Veth looked like someone who was slowly fading from existence. Family members surrounded the bed. Jake recognized none of them, but they all turned to look at him when he entered the room. There was surprise in their large eyes and something else. Something that might have been hope. "You are the human," said an elderly Thalorian standing near the window. "You are Jake Morrison." "Yes," Jake said. His voice came out rough and broken. He had to clear his throat before continuing. "I came as fast as I could." "How is Veth?" The elderly Thalorian, who introduced himself as Veth's father, explained the situation in a quiet and careful voice. The healers had tried everything. They had used ancient medicines and modern technology. They had performed rituals and offered prayers to forces Jake did not understand. Nothing had worked. Veth was slipping away, and no one knew how to stop it. Some believed it was guilt. Veth had survived the Battle of Karth Prime only because Jake had risked his life to save them. That sacrifice had created a debt, a weight, a responsibility that Veth felt unable to repay. The burden of that unfinished bond was slowly crushing the Thalorian spirit. Jake did not fully understand the spiritual aspects of what he was hearing, but he understood guilt. He understood the weight of owing someone your life. He understood how such things could eat at a person from the inside until there was nothing left. "What can I do?" he asked. Veth's father looked at him for a long moment. "Stay," the old Tellurian finally said. "Simply stay. Let Veth know that the bond between you is complete, that you do not seek repayment, that your friendship is freely given, not a transaction to be balanced." So Jake stayed. He pulled a chair beside Veth's bed and sat down. He took his friend's thin hand in his own rough fingers, and he began to talk. He talked about Earth. He described the Rocky Mountains of Colorado where he had grown up, the way the snow would cover the peaks in winter and the wildflowers would bloom in the valleys in spring. He talked about fishing in cold streams and the taste of fresh trout cooked over an open fire. He talked about his mother's cooking and his father's quiet wisdom and his sister's terrible jokes that always made him laugh anyway. He talked about the war. He remembered the soldiers they had served with, the battles they had fought, the lives they had saved together. He told stories of courage and fear and everything in between. He did not hide the ugly parts. He did not pretend to be something he was not. He simply spoke the truth as he had lived it. The Tellurian healers watched in amazement. Humans were not known for patience or stillness. They were creatures of action, always moving, always doing, always pushing forward. Yet this scarred soldier sat motionless hour after hour, day after day, never leaving his friend's side. "Why do you stay?" one young healer asked Jake on the third day. "You have your own life, your own world. Why would you travel so far and give so much for someone who is not even of your species?" Jake thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because Veth never gave up on any of us," he said. "In the worst moments of the war, when everything seemed hopeless, Veth was always there, healing the wounded, comforting the dying, giving us reason to keep fighting." He looked down at his friend's pale face. "I will not give up on them now. I refuse." Days turned into weeks. Jake barely slept. He ate only when the healers forced him to. He talked until his voice was raw and then talked some more. He held Veth's hand through the long nights and whispered promises that he meant with every fiber of his being. And slowly, something began to change. Color returned to Veth's skin. The faint glow that had nearly disappeared began to brighten again. The shallow breathing grew deeper and stronger. And one morning, after 3 weeks of vigil, Veth's eyes finally opened. "Jake," the Tellurian whispered. "You came." Jake smiled, and for the first time since the war ended, the smile reached all the way to his eyes. "Of course I came," he said. "That is what friends do." The healers called it a miracle. The family called it a blessing. But Jake called it stubbornness. Pure human stubbornness that refused to accept defeat. It was perhaps the most human thing of all, and it had saved his friend for the second time. Recovery took time. Veth's Saran grew stronger with each passing day, but the illness had left marks that would never fully heal. The Tellurian healers explained gently that Veth would never again have the strength to serve as a battlefield medic. The physical demands of that work were simply too great now. The war had taken something from Veth that could not be replaced. Jake expected his friend to be devastated by this news. He prepared himself to offer comfort and support through what he assumed would be a difficult emotional process. But Veth surprised him, as Tellurians often did. "Everything changes," Veth said with a peaceful smile. "Rivers find new paths when mountains block their way. I will find a new path too." Veth chose to become a teacher at the healing sanctuary. Young Tellurians would come from across the planet to learn the arts of medicine and care. Veth would share the wisdom gained from years of experience, including the harsh lessons learned on the battlefields of distant worlds. It was a good path, a meaningful path. Jake was proud of his friend for finding it, but Jake himself was uncertain what to do next. He had come to Endara with one purpose: to save his friend. Now that purpose was fulfilled. And he found himself once again facing the emptiness that had haunted him since the war ended. Earth seemed very far away. The life he had left behind seemed like it belonged to someone else. He thought about returning, about trying once again to fit into a world that no longer felt like home. But every time he imagined boarding a transport ship and leaving Endara behind, something inside him resisted. He did not want to go. He wanted to stay. The realization came to him one morning as he walked through the silver forest near the sanctuary. The trees seemed to whisper in the gentle wind, and the flowers turned their faces toward the rising sun. Jake stopped in a small clearing and looked up at the pale purple sky. This was where he belonged now. This peaceful world, this strange and beautiful place, this was his home. He went to the Thalorian council that governed the sanctuary and requested permission to remain on Endara permanently. He explained that he had no family waiting for him on Earth, no career, no obligations. He explained that his bond with Veth Saran had given him a connection to this world that he did not wish to break. The council deliberated for 3 days. Humans had never before been granted permanent residence on Endara. Some council members were uncertain, worried about the precedent it would set. But in the end, they recognized the depth of Jake's commitment. They had watched him sit beside Veth's bed for weeks without rest. They had seen the love and loyalty in his actions. Permission was granted. Jake Morrison became the first human to call Endara home. With his future settled, Jake found a new purpose. He approached Veth with an idea that had been growing in his mind for some time. He wanted to build a memorial, a place to honor all the soldiers who had fallen at Korath Prime and in the other battles of the war. Humans, Thalorians, and all the other species who had given their lives fighting against the Vessery Collective. Veth loved the idea immediately. Together, they designed a garden at the edge of the sanctuary. It would be a place of quiet beauty, with flowing water and gentle paths winding between beds of flowers. At its center, they would place a simple stone bearing an inscription in both English and Thalorian. The words they chose were simple but powerful. For those who gave everything so that others might live. Construction of the memorial garden took nearly a year. Jake worked alongside Thalorian builders and gardeners, learning their techniques and sharing his own ideas. He carried stones and planted flowers. He shaped paths and built small bridges over decorative streams. The work was hard, but it filled him with a satisfaction he had never known before. When the garden was finally complete, a ceremony was held to dedicate it. Hundreds of Thalorians attended, along with representatives from other species who had heard about the project. Jake stood before the crowd feeling nervous and out of place. He was not a man of speeches or grand gestures. He was just a soldier who had lost friends and wanted to remember them. But when he looked out at the faces before him, something shifted inside him. He saw hope in those eyes. He saw gratitude and respect and something that looked almost like wonder. These beings from across the galaxy had gathered to honor the dead, and they were looking at him as if he had given them a precious gift. He spoke from the heart. He talked about the soldiers he had known, the ones who had laughed with him around campfires and fought beside him in the darkest moments. He talked about the cost of war and the importance of never forgetting those who paid that cost. He asked that everyone who visited this garden take a moment to remember someone they had lost. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. Jake closed his eyes and thought of his fallen friends. He thought of the battles and the blood and the terrible beauty of sacrifice. And he made a promise to himself. He would come to this garden every day. He would stand before that stone and remember. He would keep the memory of the dead alive through the simple act of showing up, day after day, for as long as he lived. And so the ritual began. Every morning at sunrise, Jake walked to the memorial garden and stood in silence for exactly 1 hour. He did this in sunshine and rain. He did this when he was tired, and when he was sick. He never missed a single day. The garden became his church, his purpose, his reason for being. Word spread across Endara about the human soldier and his daily vigil. Tellurians began to visit the garden at sunrise, hoping to see this strange being who honored the dead with such dedication. They watched him stand motionless, eyes fixed on the stone, and they felt something stir in their peaceful hearts. They gave him a name in their language, a title of respect that had never before been given to an outsider. They called him the Keeper of Memory. Jake did not seek the title, or the attention that came with it. He was simply doing what felt right. But he could not deny that the name touched him deeply. In a galaxy that had once dismissed humans as primitive and emotional, he had found a place where those very qualities were honored and valued. He was home. He was at peace. And he would keep his promise until his last breath. Years passed on Endara, each one flowing into the next like water in the crystal streams that wound through the silver forests. Jake Morrison grew old on that peaceful world, far from the mountains of Colorado where he had been born. His hair turned silver, then white. His body slowed, and his joints began to ache in the morning cold. But still he came to the memorial garden every day without fail. The ritual never changed. Every morning, at sunrise, Jake walked the winding path to the stone at the center of the garden. He stood in silence for exactly 1 hour, remembering the friends he had lost and honoring the sacrifices they had made. Then he would bow his head, whisper a few words that only he and the dead could hear, and walk slowly back to his small home at the edge of the sanctuary. Beth Saran often accompanied him on these walks. The two old friends moved together through the dawnlight, supporting each other when the path grew steep or a wind blew cold. They rarely needed to speak. After so many years, they understood each other in ways that went beyond words. Their bond had grown deeper with time, becoming something that neither human nor Tellurian language could fully describe. Veth had become a respected teacher at the sanctuary. Generations of young healers had learned the arts of medicine under that gentle guidance. Many of them had heard the story of the Battle of Karth Prime, of the human soldier who had thrown himself over a wounded Tellurian to shield them from an explosion. They looked at Jake with awe and reverence whenever he passed them in the hallways, but Jake never saw himself as a hero. He was just a man who had done what he believed was right. He told the young Tellurians the same thing every time they asked about the war. I am not special. I simply refuse to give up. That is something any of you can do, if you choose. Word of the human soldier and his daily vigil spread far beyond Endara. Across the galaxy, beings of every species heard the story of the Keeper of Memory. Veterans of the war against the Vegari Collective began to make pilgrimages to the memorial garden, traveling vast distances just to stand beside Jake and share a moment of silence. Some of them wept. Some of them laughed as they remembered old friends and old adventures. Some simply stood quietly, unable to find words for the emotions that filled their hearts. Jake welcomed them all. He shook their hands and listened to their stories and made them feel that they were not alone in their grief and their memories. The memorial garden grew over the years. New stones were added, inscribed with the names of battles and the species that had fought in them. Gardens expanded to include plants from a dozen different worlds. Paths were built to accommodate the growing number of visitors. What had begun as a simple tribute became a sacred place of remembrance for the entire galactic coalition. And at the center of it all, every morning at sunrise, the old human soldiers stood in silence. Jake turned 87 years old on a cool autumn morning. He knew his time was growing short. His body had become frail, and his steps had grown slow. The healers had done what they could, but there were some things that even the most advanced medicine could not change. Humans lived such short lives. That was simply the way of things. He made his usual walk to the garden that morning, leaning heavily on a cane that Veth had carved for him years ago. The sunrise was especially beautiful, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple and pink. Jake stood before the stone and breathed in the cool air, feeling the peace of the place settle into his bones. He thought about his life. He thought about the scared young man who had left Earth so many years ago, full of anger and pain and desperate hope. He thought about the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the love he had found in the most unexpected places. He thought about Veth and the bond they shared, a connection that had survived war and sickness and the long, slow march of time. It had been a good life, a meaningful life. He had made a difference, not through grand gestures or great speeches, but through small acts of love and loyalty, repeated day after day for decades. Jake Morrison died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, with Veth Saran sitting beside his bed. The old Thalorian held his hand through the night, just as Jake had done so many years before in the healing sanctuary. When the end came, it was gentle and quiet, like the setting of a sun. The funeral was unlike anything Indara had ever seen. Jake was the first human ever granted the honor of a Thalorian remembrance ceremony. Thousands attended, filling the memorial garden and spilling out into the surrounding forests. Dignitaries from across the coalition came to pay their respects. Ships flew overhead in formation, their lights blinking in silent tribute. Veth Saran, ancient now, but still carrying that gentle glow, spoke at the ceremony. The old Thalorian's voice trembled with emotion, but the words were clear and strong. Humans are strange creatures. They live such short lives, yet they burn so brightly. They feel everything so deeply, love so fiercely, grieve so completely. Many species have looked upon these qualities with confusion or even contempt. We saw humans as primitive, as too emotional, as unable to understand the deeper truths of the universe. Veth paused and looked out at the gathered crowd. Humans and Thalorians and dozens of other species stood together, united in their grief and their respect. We were wrong. Jake Morrison taught us that emotion is not weakness. He showed us that love is not foolishness. He proved that honoring those we have lost is not a burden but a gift. Every day, for decades, he came to this garden and remembered. He kept the dead alive in his heart. He showed us what it truly means to be loyal. The memorial garden was renamed that day. It became the Morrison Garden of Remembrance, a tribute to the human soldier who had built it and given it meaning through his endless devotion. And every morning, at sunrise, a young Thalorian healer walked to the stone at the center of the garden and stood in silence for exactly 1 hour. They had never met Jake Morrison. They had only heard the stories. But they felt his presence in that sacred place, in the whisper of the wind through the silver trees, in the soft song of the flowers that bloomed year after year. The tradition spread. On other worlds, in other gardens and memorials, beings of every species began to observe a moment of silence at sunrise. They called it the Morrison Hour, a time to remember and honor all those who had been lost. Jake Morrison had lived a short life by the standards of many species, but his legacy would endure for centuries. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not how long you lived, but how deeply you loved. Not what you took from the universe, but what you gave. Somewhere among the stars, in the space between worlds, a human spirit smiled and moved on. The battle was finally over. The peace was finally won. And the memory would live forever.